I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 3 of season 6 of HBO's Game of Thrones. Join me, won't you? Now, I can't lie, this third episode titled Oathbreaker was, for me, just a bit of a mixed bag. But before I go on and start talking about the certain details that didn't work for me, I do want to make it clear that on this 6th season of Game of Thrones, even as I have seen certain patterns that are new and concerning begin to develop, nothing has yet occurred that, in my opinion, can't still be used and developed in at least an acceptable sort of way. Even so, on these first 3 episodes of season 6, there has just been a bit of this feeling of fatigue, like the show after 5 seasons of sprinting to remain fresh and exciting and shocking is just starting to tire a little bit. But instead of actually slowing because of that tiredness, it seems to actually be accelerating. And the 2 storylines this week that seem to be most affected by that and were mixed bags because of it were Jon's and Arya's. To discuss first, though, what I thought worked on this week's episode, I had last week actually complained about how forgettable and anticlimactic I thought Jon's return to life was, and though I still do wish that it had been something as powerfully epic as something like Dany's walk out of the flames back in season 1, there was this week, though, something so intentionally intimate and small about the moments that followed his return that I did warm to just the different close-ups of all the characters' faces as they took in and processed what seemed to be this miraculous happening. Davos really unsure if he should be more terrified or relieved, Melisandre wanting so desperately for this to be the sign that rekindled her faith and purpose, but still carrying with her so many questions, fears, and doubts, and Ghost, whose look actually might be the most telling, sensing that something's perhaps changed about his old master. And of course, Jon. And with ex-Lord Commander Snow, looking beyond, just for a moment anyways, what the writers seem to have chosen for the character as far as what he experienced after death, and who and what he seems to be now that he's returned, I didn't actually hate his response to returning from the nothingness of the beyond. It felt genuine and hurt, allowing the scenes that followed where he faced his friends and betrayers to really carry with them a lot of great struggle and confusion. With that said, while Jon was asking time and again, "Why am I back?" all I could seem to ask was, why did you leave to begin with? Because as it is currently, and yes, this could all change next week for all I know, but as it is right now, the only reason that Jon had to die was to give himself a legitimate excuse to walk away from the Night's Watch, because as we all know, the oath that he took stated that his watch ended at death, and he's died, so therefore he can now legitimately walk away. But currently, that's it. I mean, yes, the pain of betrayal has absolutely affected his psyche in marked ways, but his heart didn't need to stop beating for him to still experience that feeling. Alistair and Ollie could have stabbed him and left him to die, and the same feeling of betrayal would have certainly been elected. Speaking of those two, I did really enjoy that they stood by their decision to murder Jon until their own deaths, because I really think that conviction could potentially rattle Jon in some very interesting ways going forward. But unfortunately, if Jon, after coming out of what should have been this earth-shattering event, is neither made a Christ-like figure nor a devil in disguise, then was it really worth robbing death of its power, especially now that this week we've learned what happens beyond death? And to make all this even more frustrating, the first few episodes of season 6 have really undone and robbed the power of the season 5 finale as well. If Jon's death wasn't a permanent twist and didn't lead to some great change within the character and what he was doing with his life, then it merely becomes an extremely annoying gimmick, proved to be more interested in getting audiences to speculate for 10 months and return for a season premiere than anything else. In the same way, by so quickly backpedaling out of what I found to be the really thrilling and exciting decision to blind Arya last season for her selfish decisions, the writers are not only cheapening that, but also telling us, subconsciously anyways, not to invest in any consequences as permanent, which, again, is made all the more frustrating because it is really a mixed bag. It is exciting to see Arya growing in her assassin capabilities, and thrilling to theorize where all this may be leading for her. But more than anything, episodes like this one just make storylines like Arya's feel like a few more scenes of setup versus self-contained and individually satisfying. Now, to be fair, on Game of Thrones, especially in seasons 3 and 4, there have been a fair number of setup episodes, but what has elevated those episodes past an episode like this one is even in the scenes where they were just setting things up, they have also been phenomenally well written and acted, whereas on Oathbreaker, those same sorts of scenes kind of felt a little bit clunky, awkward, and chemistryless. Like the small council meeting at King's Landing, or the scene between Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Missandei in Meereen. Scenes that did little more for the characters than show that they weren't getting along, and even less for the plot. When the characters walked into the room, they weren't speaking or cooperating, and when they walked out, they weren't speaking or cooperating. A scene like the one at Winterfell, though, was helped along as it brought in a character like Lord Umber, who wasn't as easily bamboozled as many characters have been on this show. As we, the audience, have now spent 50 plus hours in this world and have seen the level of treachery and deception in it, we are pretty quick to distrust pretty much anyone, but especially characters like Ramsay. So it keeps scenes like the one between he and Lord Umber from becoming annoying by having the Lord in no way fall for Ramsay's story that his father was poisoned by their enemies. And though the scene did tragically reveal the decapitated head of Shagdog, the upside of having Osha and Rickon captured by Ramsay is at least they're now at Winterfell, which is where I'm assuming Jon is headed. So even as I'm sure he'll, in classic Game of Thrones fashion, pass right by Sansa and Brienne, at least he has better odds of reuniting with his stepbrother. Which does bring to mind another story and does kind of highlight something else that is beginning to wear on this show. That being, there are always a few characters, it seems anyways, that are almost constantly acting out of ignorance. Like in this case, Sam and Gilly. Now, I love Sam, but he's still convinced that for Jon, he's going to learn to be a maester, which, as we know, is no longer the case, and therefore does really undercut our investment in his storyline. Right along with that, in King's Landing council meetings, or in conversations between Varys and Vala, as absolutely gorgeous as those scenes were lit and shot, they also elected that feeling of, what's the point? They scheme, they plot, they plan, and then a couple episodes later, all of those plans are shot to sunshine. But even more importantly, I really have come to doubt, or at least feel very unclear, what exactly fuels all these characters' motivations. What are Varys and Tyrion really trying to do in Meereen? Do they actually care for that city enough to stay there indefinitely, really giving up their aspirations to return to Westeros with Dany? If so, show me. And actually, back at King's Landing, what made me so acutely aware of how little weight Lady Tyrell's scheming to get Margaery out of prison carried was how it contrasted Tommen's meeting with the High Sparrow. Part of it came through the character's youth and simplicity of desire, but you could also just genuinely see the fear and desperation that fueled his actions, and believe in his feelings of anger, powerlessness, and humiliation. Which, in a lot of ways, is exactly what Dany has been experiencing this week, which surprisingly turned out to be one of my favorite storylines of the episode. And part of that comes from, I feel like I, and maybe this entire show right now, is identifying with Dany. I've been on board for 5 award-winning seasons, always holding on to that belief that this show has a destiny, a great, entertaining, powerful destiny. And like Dany, who's accrued one impressive title after the next, this show has won Emmys, Peabodys, Golden Globes, and on and on. But right now, in this time of uncertainty, none of that matters. And that scene as Dany encountered those women who at one time, just like her, had believed they were destined for greatness, but who are now hidden away, slowly forgotten, their names fading into obscurity. That scene captured so well that feeling of, is it worth pressing on? Will her journey end the way that she always hoped it would back at the beginning? And as that scene elected that feeling, the almost exact feeling that I was hoping it would last week, I found my own hope in the show being rekindled just slightly. Because again, I'm not trying to be overly negative about the show right now. Everything is not as grim and as horrible as I may have made it sound in this review. So with that said, let's go ahead and segue into this week's Twitter question, which comes to us from David Halberstadt. Where do you think Bran's journeys into the past are leading? Well, thank you for the question, Dave. And considering that the flashbacks in both the season premiere as well as this episode not only mentioned Lena Stark, but both times pulled back from revealing too much about her, and considering that she remains one of the show's central mysteries, I think it would be safe to assume that we will ultimately meet her and discover what exactly her and Rhaegar's relationship was, as well as potentially discover if she is or is not Jon Snow's mother. Also, just to praise that flashback, I really did find it fittingly revelatory for this world, as well as for the character, that Bran was forced to witness this piece of history and discover that what was known and passed down to him was in fact only part of the truth. Which again, I think perfectly tees up the reveal that Lena all those years ago wasn't actually kidnapped by Rhaegar at all, but was in fact in love with the Mad King and ran away with him. And also, and I can see a lot of people actually hating this, but the idea of Bran not only being able to witness these past events, but actually reach out and interact with them, I think is so cool and would certainly help him become less of the inactive bystander that he currently is. What does continue to be just a little bit silly and somewhat annoying are the writers constantly feeling like they need to justify justify these brief, not fully revelatory journeys into the past by having the Three-Eyed Raven constantly say things like, "It's time to leave. It's dangerous if we stay too long." We get it. We know that you can't reveal everything in that first episode, but whether you, the writers, intend to or not, by continually bringing up that concept that if you stay in that place too long, you will be swallowed by it and completely lost in it, you are actually making us, the viewer, a promise that something like that will happen to one of these characters. And if it doesn't, then it will feel like we invested in those threats, which will have been revealed to be idle, all for naught. Which does make me hope that at some point, impatient for answers, Bran will push things too far, forcing the Three-Eyed Raven to sacrifice himself for the young warg. Crazier still, what if in fact the Three-Eyed Raven is Bran, who at some point gets bodily lost in the past and has just been stuck in this cave ever since, these roots growing up around him? Put that in your proverbial pipe and smoke it. So, to close things out, my friends, I myself do, in small ways anyways, understand the kind of current tired feeling that this show seems to be enduring. Even on these reviews, I can oftentimes spend so much time in the first 2/3 of an episode that by the time I get to the end, I'm just so tired that I want to just sprint to the end and get through it as quickly as possible, which really does suck, because if there's any one thing that a show wants to just rock at and stick, it's the landing, because in the end, it doesn't matter how gloriously turbulence-free the flight was. If the plane erupts into flames upon landing, that's really all that its passengers are going to remember. But again, I still have faith. I really do believe that even as this show, and this episode particularly, had a few failings in it, I will stand up and say to the show what Davos said to Jon after he said, "I failed. Good. Now go fail again." There is certainly more than enough light left on the show to return to the former blaze that we all grew to know and love over the years, and I for one believe that it can and will happen. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode. I would still love to know what you guys thought of the episode, so definitely comment below and let me know. Do you feel like things are dwindling just slightly, or did you enjoy this episode just as much as you have episodes in the past? Also, I would love to continue to interact with you guys more on Twitter, so definitely hop on over to there and tweet out all of your questions, hashtagging them the Heartbeat, and I will do my very best to answer as many of them as I can right here on the show each week. Also, I definitely want to give my friends over at Storyforge a shout out. They're a group of really great artists who have put out some really fun audio productions as well as webcomics, and I will leave a link for their content below. Finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.